My name is Diane Davis. I'm a professor of urbanism and development here at the Graduate School of Design. And I want to welcome you to the panel on neighborhoods and neighborliness. As an urban sociologist by training, I'm really drawn to the title of this panel and what I see it as trying to accomplish, which is to think about social relations in space in a new way. Or at least that's my reading of this because of the focus on neighborhoods and neighborliness rather than, for example, the rather worn-out concept of community. In sociology, of course, the concept of community has been at the heart of discussions about social relationships in physical space. But whether it really maps onto the physicality of the built environment, in what ways, how and why, has been a source of continuing discussion and debate in urban sociology since the founding fathers, and they were fathers at the time, raised the issue of the concept of community. So we're thinking of Zimmel, Tönnies, Baver, even Durkheim, etc. So today we're going to re-engage that debate again, or those themes, but from the vantage, this new conceptual vantage point, of which I think the concept of neighborliness is a really important one. And my hope is that in this panel that we can address some of the following sets of questions. One is, in what ways does the concept of neighborliness provide us a new analytical lens for understanding or unpacking social relationships among citizens? In what ways that are not afforded when we use the concept or when we study community, or even the concept of civic values, if we want to think about politics too. The second was a question, does neighborliness as a social concept produce, or is it produced by, the quotidian use of everyday urban space or the built environment? In other words, what's the causality? Third, returning to the overarching concern we have in this conference today about the politics of the urban, one question we might consider is whether neighborliness creates new political spaces, kind of building on Neil's introduction, and continuing with some of the framing issues that Neil laid out earlier. I'm particularly interested in whether the social dynamics associated with neighborliness exist outside of or are embedded within the state sphere or state spaces, and at what scale. In other words, could we or should we understand neighborliness as a counter-hegemonic project, in other words, an alternative or competing sovereignty or imagined community? And under what conditions and why? And again, that's to kind of rethink some of the larger framing issues that Neil laid out. Or might the answer to that question about neighborliness and its political possibility, how it's embedded with the state, have something to do with the scale of neighborliness that we're looking at? And finally, that issue about the scale makes me think that I hope we can return at some time, if not in this panel, throughout the rest of the day, to reflect conceptually about the scale at which the concept of neighborliness is robust. Is it really just very, very local, or can we think about neighborliness at the level of a city or even a nation state? And would the way we think about neighborliness at those different scales be embedded in the physicality of the built environment in the same way? I'm going to stop here with those questions, and I actually don't even know if our panelists have their presentations have anything to do with those questions, but I think if anybody could reflect on them either implicitly or indirectly, it would be this combination of people. We start with three really leading scholars that look at social or spatial relationships at different scales and in different ways. We will go in the order that they're listed in the program, beginning first with Rob Samson, who is the Henry Ford II Professor of Social Sciences here at Harvard, a absolutely leading urban sociologist. I'm on the City and Community Council, and he wins awards almost every year for his work on neighborhoods, particularly his work on Chicago and Boston and other sets of things looking at social spatial relationships. Then we'll move to Loi Waquant, professor of sociology at the University of California in Berkeley, a master ethnographer, of urban communities, looking at issues of race and other race, class, power at the level of community, but also has worked across different empirical and theoretical scales, doing a lot of work on the state and state power in urban life. And then we'll end with Rahul Mhotra, the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design here, who stands, I would say, at the forefront of a small but growing cohort of urban designers who take sociality and social relations seriously, both in their writings about urban design and in their practice of urban design. So without further ado, we'll start with Rob.
Thank you, Diane. I don't know that I'll answer all your questions, probably not even a few of them, but let me say I'm really happy to be here. The context of graduate design, I don't know anything about it. Like the formal approach, huh? I'm an informal guy. I'm not an urban planner, and in fact, I thought I would list my affiliations here in terms of sociology, Radcliffe Institute, and GSD. I was asked to be an affiliated professor in urban planning, but I emphasize that I am an interloper. Nonetheless, I think it's really exciting what's going on in the school in terms of this conference, the new hires, and I'm excited about the future, actually, to think about the intersection of the built environment with the social environment. And since I don't know anything about the built environment, I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'm deep interest in it. The first session was fascinating. But what I'm going to do is to take you on a tour, if you will, of a research project that has at its heart trying to understand the nature of social relationships, networks, organizations in the contemporary city, with the site actually being along the lines that Diane was talking about, neighborhoods. Neighborhoods conceptualized as a geographic section of larger community with distinctive social characteristics. So it's really the intersection of the spatial and the social that I'm interested in. And I conceive of neighborhood actually in a very abstract way at some level, almost in a fractal way, that has multiple scales. And in my work, I look at those scales right down to the street corner level, and I love the film intro yesterday to Saskia's talk, with the artistic dancing on the street corner, to larger neighborhoods, to communities that are recognized in political terms, whether it be Beacon Hill in Boston, Kensington in London, you name it, or even around the world, the notion of a political residential community. I go back and forth between all of these. And I've worked for the last, 15 years or so on a research project in Chicago, and I'm not a dashed Chicago School scholar, I guess, in a way, although I reject the things that are wrong about it. But Chicago is an interesting site as a city in a number of ways. It's not only the third largest city in the U.S., but it's representative in terms of a lot of trends and demographics and migration and heterogeneity. But also, I mean, it's inspired not just scholarship, but artistic works, and it's a quintessential American city, or as Norman Mailer put it, the great American city. And even Tony Jute, the great historian who recently died, who wrote an ode to New York, stated that New York is the world city, and I think that's correct, but it will never be the great American city. That's always Chicago. So what I do in a recent book that articulates a lot of this, I can't present it all because it's 550 pages. So in 15 minutes, I want to just give you a sense of the ideas, that's all, and some pictures that capture some of those ideas. And I started out actually with a walking tour, qualitatively, going through particular neighborhoods, walking from the center of the sort of heart of the city in terms of what you might know about the Magnificent Mile. We'll see if we can find it here. On the near north side. And it's interesting that in 1929, Henry Zorbo of the Chicago School published The Gold Coast and the Slum, and the idea of the juxtaposition of wealth on the Gold Coast to the slum. And actually, it's interestingly enough still here. He even pointed out Death Corner in 1929, which the very intersection, I'll show you a picture of it, is where Cabrini Green was built. In 1929, it was an Italian, high crime, so-called disorganized neighborhood. It's had an interesting history over the years. I end the book walk down from the near north side to the loop, near north side, through areas of transition, the takedown of public housing in Chicago, through middle-class African-American neighborhoods, mixed, heterogeneous neighborhoods like Hyde Park, the so-called slum, and really show the great differentiation. We know we're told we live in a placeless world. That's just wrong. It's very differentiated on a number of dimensions, and that's really what I want to get across. Number one, concentration by place, in this case by neighborhood and community. And secondly, things go together. In this case, I also showed the bird's eye view, homicide. The larger the star, this is simple now, the greater the rate of homicide going for population size. And it's shaded by child health, low birth weight babies, infant mortality. So women giving birth to low birth weight kids and adults, usually males, killing one another. These things go together in a very careful way. And careful research, by the way, and former graduate student Pat Sharkey has shown that exposure to violence is harmful to child development. So we really need to understand these things. And it's not just bad stuff. This conference is about, in part, political behavior. This is a picture I took in Roseland on the south side, far south side of Chicago. In a way, there's a lot of political activity that I want to emphasize here. You know, the cover for this conference, you know, the riots, this is what gets all the attention. But there's actually lots of civic engagement that goes on that's hidden. We actually studied this over 3 or 4 decades. These are men, African-American men, who we're told are not involved in the community, protesting and rallying against violence. It turns out that a block away, a kid had been murdered outside of school during the day. This is not an uncommon event, and not only is it not uncommon as an immigration rights rally, that these things are spatially concentrated as well in particular neighborhoods, and they have histories to them. I'm not going to tell you how I collected these data because it would take too long, but suffice it to say, this shows low, medium, and high, just to make it simple, collective civic action, the propensity to collective civic events. Things like marches, rallies, and it's not just protests against the Iraq War, they're in here, but also things like the library. We need a new library. The fire station, the disrepair in a public park. People making claims for positive collective things. We collected data on this over several decades, and what you'll note, and these are actual events which we geocoded time and space, that over a long period of time, there's a real structure to this. Right? There's a sense in which some communities are civically prone to these collective acts, and it's not, and I'll show you in a bit, it's not just about, unlike what some argue, sort of individual propensity, and I can't tell you how I reject that argument in the data, but I look at things like voting and other individual characteristics. And there's something about the collective emergent nature. And what I want to show you here, though, is, again, that it's very concentrated and it's persistent over time. So concentration, things go together, persistence. And we tend to study social change, and we must study social change. But as my colleague Orlando Patterson has argued, we tend to be weak on theory of continuity, large-scale historical continuities. And that's, in part, what I'm interested in. Another example of continuity. This is over from 1960 to 2000. This is just simply the percentage of families in poverty. This is concentrated poverty, what Bill Wilson made famous in the truly disadvantaged. This is in 2000. If you think about it, 1960, this is pre many of the civil rights legislation. 60s, riots, racial change, out-migration from the central city, explosion increase in the crime rate, then moving into great waves of immigration, then the greatest decline in crime that we've seen in 40 years. And yet, what do we see? The correlation in social science is pretty damn high, 0.78, and then we see change. Some neighborhoods doing better and some getting worse, and I analyze that as well. So there's both stability and change. We really need to understand both of this, but the persistence is quite remarkable. By the way, it's not just Chicago. I just want to emphasize that. Believe it or not, this is every single neighborhood is proxied by a census tract in the United States, some 64,000 census tracts, and this is the change over the decade when welfare policy radically changed at the federal policy level, and the sense in which welfare dependence concentrated in space is stable. There's also change, but it's remarkable how close the lines match between Chicago and all other tracks. And even going to the present, the Great Recession has exacerbated inequality. But the way I think about it is it's not overturning. What it's doing is there's a way in which spaces are refracting these larger social changes. It's manifested in space, and I'm really trying to understand how it happens. So you can see, for example, how foreclosures, and this is the latest data I could get on foreclosures, are imposed on, in fact, formerly disadvantaged communities, but also middle-class African-American communities. And this is the concentrated disadvantage index in 2000. Post-recession, there's actually not good census data that we can get, so we have to do a proxy. This is based on Chicago Housing Information Authority data. And we still see this broad, strong persistence and the superimposition on formerly disadvantaged communities with an extra structural shock. And so we need to understand that. That's in part what the project is about. So that's real quick. I'm going to blow through some other pictures as well. But so as a sociologist, an urban sociologist, and life course theorist, and criminologist, I'm obsessed with social mechanisms and processes, the social relationships that lie behind these more sort of abstract and structural forces that we often talk about, which are unbelievably important, but we need to unpack them. So, concentration of poverty, racial segregation. How does it affect social relationships, social ties? You'll see aspects of norms, of cynicism about society, legitimacy of institutions, and processes, change, stability and change. And secondly, and I won't talk about it today, methodological. To me, method comes from theory. If I'm interested in the contextual world, we really need methods that take seriously that world. And with colleagues, we've argued and put forth statistical methods and approaches, which we're all entitled to our own jargon, I suppose. We call ecometrics. But it makes sense, right? It's a metric for thinking about ecology or social ecology. We've had 100 years of psychometrics, which has developed very precise and valid instruments for measuring individual differences. There's a different logic, I argue, to the measurement of social neighborhood characteristics. I won't bore you with the statistical details. What we've done is through, again, a large-scale project in Chicago that started in 1995. Let me just tell you a couple quick things about it. It was huge. It's a team-based effort. It involved a multiple cohort study of children, including children from birth. We enrolled pregnant women and studied their kids, and all the way up to teenagers for about 8 years intensively. And this is the developmental psychological part, which I just won't get into today. We were talking the other day that developmental psychology, the life course, has been ignored by urbanists. It's a mistake. Secondly, community survey to get at these sort of social processes. We interviewed about 8,000 people in Chicago over time. Secondly, systematic social observation. Think of Google Street View. We actually beat them to it. In 1995, we drove down the street, seriously, literally, in sport utility vehicles with 2 cameras mounted and videotaped each side of the street and coded them in great detail, 22,000 face blocks. And thirdly, we interviewed leaders, the elites. We don't want to know just what people say, but actually what the politicians and bankers and so forth say. So let's go on and just I'll give you a feel, and I want to end, though, with the notion of it's not just the neighborhood, the connection to the larger city. One thing is that the structuration of these events. So you saw those collective civic events. Well, if we now just make it a little bit simpler and the joined arms here are communities which have high rates of this collective civic engagement. Again, these are not people necessarily that vote. And by the way, the checkbox is the rate of voting in the community. And you can see that it doesn't align necessarily with this collective civicness. And so the political science view of this, I think, is somewhat problematic. And what's really driving it, in part, is the organizational form of the community. And we've collected data and have a chapter in the book and more that really looks at the notion of the organizational form of the community, organizational density. Another concept is collective efficacy, which is another kind of, think of it as cooperation or collective involvement in community, the extent to which people watch out for other kids in the community, the extent to which people will get together if, let's say, the school needs a library, or we did a vignette, the fire station's about to close, would you get together? And collective efficacy can be measured well, and controlling for poverty and the usual suspects, we find that it's related to lower crime. And, also did a replication in Stockholm, and I put this up here to show you the simultaneous effects of what you might think of as country or state effects, that in every single case, Chicago has higher violence than Stockholm. I mean, this is not explained by neighborhood. But what's interesting is that the form of the social process is still working similar in each place. And I have another chart in the book which shows concentration disadvantage in Stockholm and Chicago. And it too has the same form, except concentration disadvantage stops at one point in the distribution, and Chicago just keeps going. That's an inequality effect at the societal level that's superimposed on neighborhoods, but it doesn't deny these important fundamental social processes. Another, and this was the fun part of the project in part, was I'm going to claim here, it even matters where you have a heart attack or where you drop your letter that you're going to mail on the way to work. What we did is a Stanley Milgram experiment, really, for contextual world. We randomly dropped thousands of letters, stamped, randomized the time we had, whether it was raining, what kind of street it was on, incredible detail. It's described in the book. Lo and behold, huge differences in the rate at which letters are returned by community, and it even matches up to the rate at which people give CPR to victims of heart attacks. And I go into the book in great detail, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to some of our stereotypes. Some of the most diverse communities, for example, have high rates of CPR on the street, so you would think, well, Louis Worth, I think, what's going on here? Heterogeneity is not necessarily linked to lower normative other behavior. But what I want to, I'm going to skip over that, what I want to argue at the sort of broader level is that these kinds of characteristics, and they're hard to get at, although we spent a lot of time trying to do it, things like collective efficacy, civic action, altruistic character, and legal and moral cynicism, which I haven't talked a lot about here. But we asked people about their attitudes towards institutions, about others, and things like, people say things like, well, it's okay to get around the law if you can get away with it. Everyone's out for themselves. In a sense, it's anti-cooperation. It's sort of anti-altruism. And we're able to measure these things through a combination of surveys, observation, and kind of field experiments. And the combination, is what I want to argue, tells us something about the social character of communities, and that's fundamentally important. And I think the relationship to the built environment is also important. Now, what I want to also go on to tell you about, this goes back to the psychological bit, and then I'm going to jump to the macro and end. We have, I think, in urban sociology, forgotten or set aside perceptions and norms and culture. And a big part of the project is about how people respond cognitively and evaluate, in terms of meaning, public spaces. This is a picture from the book. This is Death Corner, 1929, in 2010. It's literally the corner of Oak and Cambridge. And it's a site of great contestation that we've been talking about. This is an abandoned old building, water termination. Around the corner, you can't see them, are guys dealing drugs. Across the street, there's litter. Cabrini Green is kind of on this side of the street, torn down. But over here are new apartment buildings and gentrification. And as I said in the book, you go over here and there's a sign of, for a exercise and a beautiful woman, and it says, come exercise, look better naked. And like the contradiction is unbelievable. You've got people that are dealing drugs, begging for money, and the developers want this land. It's contested land. It's stigmatized land. This is important stuff, I argue. And what we've done, or what I've done, is to take the images that we can actually code from. This is you have to ask yourself this. I'm not going to give you the answer. Is this graffiti? Is this disorder? Well, in many cases you would say it is. It's got all the elements. People have argued that it's linked to crime, migration, out-migration, health. So we've coded this, and I have, I'm not going to be able to go through this, but basically have argued that those very images cannot be understood just as objective disorder, which was really the broken windows thesis. And James Q. Wilson died yesterday. I don't know if anybody knows the broken windows theorist. He was a brilliant guy. And the broken windows theory was important, but the essential elements of it, he was really more interested in this, the observed disorder, which is going to lead to crime and so forth. But what we find is that people vary tremendously in terms of their own individual perceptions within the same context, and given the history of inequality in the United States, the real history of racial segregation being linked to crime and disorder, that people, when they view and see what they can see on the streets, it's not just disorder, it's also people. And through implicit bias and stigmatized meanings, that leads to perceived disorder, which has consequences. And I'm going to end with the note that I study not just the, okay, so I'm about to wrap up here, but I'm still within my 20 minutes. Is spatial inequality, leadership, organizational networks, and residential migration. What I want to just show you in images is what I mean by this. So there's characteristics of the community I've talked about in terms of their collectiveness or not, altruism and so forth. But the city is characterized by all kinds of flows and networks. I'm not going to tell you how we got this. It took about 6 years, but these are the leaders, and these are the aldermen, these are businessmen, these are community organizations, these are the principals, these are priests, and that's Mr. Big. He really is Mr. Big. I can't tell you who he is, but you can guess. This is the individual level networks of how people are connected, but the point is these are not just across people, but they cross-cut space. And they cross-cut organizations. What I'm currently studying, and part in the book, is how politics, for example, is linked or not to law and religion. And there's fascinating relationships, and how these various linkages take place bear, I show, on the perceptions of the residents whom are supposedly being served by leaders, on their perception of legitimacy. And furthermore, this is actually what I call the higher order structure of Chicago. This shows how communities themselves serve as conduits. So if you think of flows, there's actually flows of information. These are ties of these different leaders that cross-cut communities. But what I show is that how you are linked, in this sense, at the spatial level of a community to the larger structure, actually bears on resources and things that happen within the community. So we have to elide this notion that there's an internal and an external. They're constantly being penetrated, and that's the form of study. And similarly, this is migration. This is our sample. In 6 years, 50% of the people approximately moved, and they're cross-cutting all kinds of neighborhoods. There is no such thing as a neighborhood that has, it's about the borders. You think about Saskia's flows across the world. There's flows across the city. And what we do is tie these cross-cutting flows residentially to the information flows and then the internal structure of the city. So conceptually then, I'll end with this. This is the argument that what I'm trying to do is to take seriously individuals, their psychology, their choice, their selection. People at all levels of constraint have choice, but they are constrained, and we need to study that and how the higher order structures, whether it be the state, these political networks. I'm not saying this is the most important. I'm saying this is a fundamental feature of society that's still persistent, and how that plays out. And that is all this stuff. If you want to read more, it's in a book that came out 3 weeks ago. So I guess it's in the store. Great American City, Chicago, and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. Thanks a lot.
I have only one picture. I was trying to see Chantal. She was here earlier. See if she can show the picture.
I think it's 4. I'm going to sue.
It's actually a picture of one of the neighborhoods that it was on the lower side,
Which one?
just south of Hyde Park, in the neighborhood of Woodlawn.
Oh, yeah.
Is the one picture that I'm going to use as the backdrop to my presentation. Okay, I've entitled my presentation Neighborhood Denigration and State Effects as Founts of Urban Inequality. And I want to thank Mohsen Mostafavi for this invitation, which plucks me from my sabbatical leave in Paris, where I'm writing and thinking in a different language on a completely different topic on the theory of habitus of embodiment. So I had to put my sort of English language brain and my urban sociology brain back on while flying to try to prepare for this discussion. I hope that it'll get rolling in about 3 minutes, since I only have 20 minutes to present. And I'm delighted to be here because of the stellar group of scholars that have been brought to this conference, and I really feel like I would want to give up my time and hear more about particularly Rob's presentation. It's just fascinating. What I want to talk about is the really representations of neighborliness, the symbolic casting of neighborliness, and in particular of its opposite, if you wish, anti-neighborliness. I want to talk about neighborhood stigmatization or territorial defamation, and because I believe that the denigration of particular places, neighborhood taint, is a distinctive phenomenon of urban poverty in the contemporary era that's correlative of the breakdown and the dissolution of traditional neighborhoods of relegation, the neighborhoods that are at the bottom of the system of places that construct an urban hierarchy, neighborhoods of relegation of the 40th Keynesian period in the industrial capitalism, which were the black ghetto in the United States and the working class territories of Western Europe. They have broken down, they have become transformed, and one of the elements of this transformation has been the defamation of these places, the denigration, the symbolic taint attached to being a resident of that place. And I want to argue that in particular, some of the protests that we've seen in recent years, and particularly, for instance, the British riots of last summer, were, of course, had multiple mechanisms and motives, but in part they were a reaction against this process of defamation that includes a degradation of the residents, a skewing of social relations, and a warping of elite representations and state policies towards these neighborhoods. And this builds on my book, Urban Outcasts, which sums up a decade of research with 3 targets, and the book makes 3 arguments. First, I try to explain the state and fate of the black American ghetto after the 60s riots, and I argue against the tale of the underclass, or against simply a story of racial segregation, that there's been a shift, the breakdown, the collapse, the implosion of the communal ghetto of the 40s Keynesian era between 1915 and 1965, and its replacement by a novel socio-spatial formation that I call the hyper-ghetto, and that this transformation is economically underdetermined and politically overdetermined by shifts in state policies of urban retrenchment, social disinvestment, and penal reinvestment of the neighborhoods of relegation. So after having examined the state and fate of the black American ghetto, I turn to Western Europe, and I compare the structure, the experience, and the dynamics of urban relegation in France and in the US. And I refute what I call the thesis of convergence, this idea that working class or immigrant neighborhoods in Western Europe are turning into ghettos on the pattern of the United States. I show that, in fact, they diverge, that the working class territories of Western Europe are turning into anti-ghettos. They are moving away from the pattern of the ghetto and not closer to it. So I refute the thesis of convergence, and then I put forth instead what I call the thesis of emergence, the emergence of a new regime of marginality that I call advanced marginality, because it's neither the residual effect nor a cyclical phenomenon, but rather it lies ahead of us. It is inscribed in the future of advanced societies subjected to the strains of capitalist deregulation and financial restructuring. And to sum up, advanced marginality is superseding the ghetto on the American side and superseding traditional working class territories on the European side. It is the product, and in the book I list 6 synchronic features of advanced marginality, 4 dynamic cross-sectional processes that feed it, and let me just mention just 3 of them. Advanced marginality is the product of the fragmentation of wage labor in particular, and the rise and persistence of mass unemployment and casual, the routinization, normalization of routinized, of part-time, sub-poverty wage labor for the unskilled fractions of the post-industrial working class. It's also the product of the functional disconnection between neighborhoods of relegation and the national and global economy. And thirdly, and this is where I'll stop for a while, it's also the product of territorial stigmatization and the retraction and the protections traditionally offered by the social state. And here I want to focus on territorial stigmatization to capture the salient symbolic dimension of advanced marginality in the dualizing metropolis at century's turn. I argue that the symbolic denigration of a place is a major determinant of the life chances of its residents, and that it operates in tandem with the power of the state to impose and to diffuse shared representations of problem populations and problem territories. Indeed, I've said one of the springs of the protests and street clashes that we've seen against representatives of the state, in particular the police, are about the defamation of these places and are about the skewing of the behavior of state agencies, most prominently the police, towards the residents of this place. In other words, the police can behave in these places in ways they would never behave in upper-class districts, in part because these places are seen as urban hellholes, as the worst places of vice and violence, and so the state can act in ways that it would not act otherwise. So the argument is a shadow dialogue with the work of my mentor and friend Bill Wilson, and also I think with the work of Rob Samson here, who is the rare quantitative sociologist of neighborhood who's paid close analytic empirical attention to the meaning and to the interconnection between social structure and action. He's also been concerned with stigma in neighborhoods and off neighborhoods, and he focuses on the neighborhood level. And I want to take us to the level of the state. And I want to argue that the state is the major agency that diffuses, anchors, legitimizes, and gives authority to these negative representations of places and other residents, and therefore leads to a whole series of changes in self-conception and in behavior among the residents of those neighborhoods, among the urban citizenry that lives around those neighborhoods, among civil and commercial operators, in particular firms and businesses, and we can see this in the rise of address discrimination among firms when they see applicants from these areas, and most importantly among state elites and state policies. So neighborliness, I would argue, is a property permitted by the anchoring of social space and symbolic space into physical space. And in this anchoring, the state is the key agency. So the notion of territorial stigmatization really is a notion that I forged out of field work. It grew out of conducting face-to-face interviews with the administrative managers of urban policy in France, who are, of course, located right in the center of Paris, in one of the most well-to-do, favorably represented neighborhoods. And when I interviewed them about these new urban policies targeted at the 776 so-called sensitive neighborhoods of France, everything in their tone, their vocabulary, their posture, their gesture expressed regret at being in charge of a mission and a population degraded and therefore degrading. And they spoke about the policies of which they were in charge with a tremolo of anguish and disgust in their voice. Very interestingly enough, I found the same feeling of disgust and indignity at the very bottom of the urban ladder when I conducted field work among the residents of the 4000 housing project, a large-scale housing project, public housing concentration in the Parisian industrial periphery in the city of La Courneuve, and as well as among black residents, black Americans trapped in Chicago's hyper-ghetto. So the fieldwork led me to develop this notion of territorial stigmatization, which differs from ethnic stigmatization, and which we can contrapose to what Irving Goffman characterized as physical stigma, moral stigma, and tribal stigma. Working class neighborhoods, dispossessed districts, or immigrant enclaves have never enjoyed a good reputation, and the city has always had its unseemly zones, its vice districts, its skid rows, and its shady areas enshrouded in sulfurous aura. But a new phenomenon has arisen in the past 2 decades. In all of the advanced countries, a small number of neighborhoods and localities have become publicly known, indeed renowned, throughout the national society as pits of social and moral perdition. The huge social housing complex of Robert Taylor Homes, or Cabrini Green in Chicago, Bobigny in the eastern periphery of Paris, the district of Moss Side in Manchester, Neukölln in Berlin, Tensta at the edge of Stockholm, where I was recently in Sweden. Now there's a competition. Now Rosengård in Malmö has taken over Tensta as the one neighborhood about which the Swedish are all fearful about, and that everybody in the remotest village of Sweden, people know and fear Rosengård. These names have become so many national eponyms for urban horror. They inspire dread and vilification throughout the society. A blemish of place has crystallized, which has become superimposed on the dishonor of class and ethnicity that already strikes their residents and exerts its own effect. The effect of spatial stigmatization is a distinctive effect, distinctive from the tribal, moral, and corporal marks previously analyzed by Irving Goffman, And this mark, this stigma, contributes powerfully to the spiral of social disintegration and symbolic defamation. If I had more time, I would read you a transcript from a tape that I made driving down, this is 63rd Street on the south side of Chicago, for those of you who know the university. It's now part of the university almost. It used to be, this is October of 1990, it used to be, in a sense, on another planet, even though it was only 200 yards from the law school. But in a different society, as it were. I would read you the transcript of the description of the street given by one of my buddies from the boxing gym, in which I carried out field work there, where he talks about his sentiment about being a resident of this neighborhood. And he describes the built environment, and he makes links between the built environment, the sense of self, the sense of community, and the sense of being cast out and being rejected by the city's authorities. So this scene of urban desolation and social despair, one of the ghostly thoroughfares that transects Chicago's collapsing black ghetto at century's close, invites us to reflect on the link between the built environment, social structure, and collective psychology. More precisely, it points to the need to elaborate theoretically and empirically the connections between urban desolation as a physical phenomenon and symbolic denigration in America's racialized urban core, and then beyond in the assorted territories of relegation of the dualizing metropolis of the advanced society. We want to understand here how the daily experience of material dilapidation, ethno-racial seclusion, and socioeconomic marginality translates into a corrosion of the self, the rasping and fraying of interpersonal relationships, and the skewing of social policy towards these neighborhoods through the mediation of this sulfurous cognition fastened on a defamed place. And if I had more time, I would go to show you that the French School of Sociology of Émile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss and Maurice Alvax were concerned about this relationship between social structure and collective representation. I would show also that the Chicago School was of course concerned, posited a correspondence between metropolitan morphology and psychology, drawing the moral regions that were supposed to correspond to so many ethnic neighborhoods. I would show also that the classic studies of the crisis of the dark ghetto of the 60s also was concerned with the collective deprecation and depression, but they always tied it to material conditions, to unemployment, to racial segregation, never to the specific representation of that place as a place of violence, and perdition. So here what we see, this barren, brutal scenery featured on the picture, as I said, is located barely 200 yards from the University of Chicago Law School. It's a few blocks east of the boxing gym, of the Woodlawn boxing gym that served as the hub for the ethnographic component of two nested studies that I carried out in the early 90s. One is a carnal anthropology of prize fighting as a plebeian bodily craft that I carried out there, and that's recorded in the book Body and Soul, Ethnographic Notebooks of an Apprentice Boxer. And the other is the comparative sociology of the dynamics of and experience of urban marginality in the Black American ghetto and the urban periphery of Western Europe over the ensuing decade. That is recorded in the book Urban Outcasts. And what does this picture tell us? First of all, it gives us a glimpse of the physical dilapidation, social decay, and stunning depopulation of the neighborhood that are the first palpable features of everyday life in the American hyperghetto at the close of the century. Just to give you an idea, in the half century after 1950, Woodlawn the population in Woodlawn went from 81,000 to a mere 27,000. The number of housing units plummeted from 29,000 to 13,000, with fully one-fifth of the remaining structures left vacant. There was a process of economic involution and organizational desertification that set in, with the decline and deaths of hundreds of commercial, social, and cultural establishments, from machine shops, barber shops, hotels and brothels, theaters and restaurants, churches, banks, clothing outlets, daycare centers. The neighborhood, these turned a vibrant neighborhood into an urban wasteland, doubly segregated by race and class. The bustling commercial artery of 63rd Street mutated into a lugubrious strip dotted with the burnt-out carcasses of stores, boarded-up buildings, vacant lots strewn with weeds, broken glass, and garbage. What's the effect of this on the consciousness of the residents? First, if I could read you the transcript, you would show that the effect of this is it translates into collective demoralization, registered in feelings of dejection, dread, anger, as well as the inordinately high rates of malnutrition and obesity combined in the same neighborhoods, attested here by the advertisement for the big fish. High rates of alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, and assorted mental affliction detected in the hyperghetto. The material crumbling of the neighborhood is but the physical manifestation of the rapid and sudden closure of the opportunity structure, incarnated by the social phantoms that roam the street for whom existence is reduced to sheer subsistence, where the amputation of objective life chances collapses the social environment and subjective expectations, leaving little room between utter despair and oneirism being represented on the legal side by massive participation of the residents in the Illinois state lottery, and on the illegal side by the massive participation in narcotics distribution and consumption. Second element, the physical disrepair and institutional dilapidation of this neighborhood cannot but generate an abiding sense of social inferiority for the residents. It communicates to the residents that they are second or third class citizens undeserving of the attention of city officials and of the care of its agencies. This message of social worthlessness is conveyed not only by the crumbling bridges, broken sidewalks, leaking sewers, and by the corrugated hulk of the elevated train line that would get dismantled, which you can see here. This is the L train, and it got dismantled, torn down just about 3 years after I took the picture, and essentially leaving this whole section of the of Woodlawn without access to public transportation. But we also see it in the gradual replacement of the social welfare treatment of marginality by its punitive management through the aggressive rolling out of the police, the courts, and the prison in and around the hyperghetto, leading to astronomical rates of incarceration for lower-class blacks from the hyperghetto. This is a neighborhood in which more than half of the young men from this neighborhood are not in the neighborhood because they are serving time downstate in the prisons of the Illinois Department of Corrections. And this, I tell the tale of the rolling out of the penal state to contain and control, curb the disorders of the hyperghetto in my book, Punishing the Poor. It is also reinforced by the distinctive advertising imagery of which we have a sample on the picture that visually dominates the street. Billboards in this neighborhood invites passersby to seek succor in the embrace of hard liquor, vamping with the brothers, Cold 45, misbehaving, Canadian Mist, Be Cool, Smirnoff vodka. The advertisement also remind them of their present economic quandary and of the dreary fate awaiting their future. There was a big sign right next, over on the next block that said, "Get a job, call now, $19." It was a phone number where you called supposedly to get a contact with a job, and once you called, you were debited for the princely sum of $19. There was another sign that said, "No school, no future." Try to goad the children of the neighborhood to stay in school. And they invite them to resolve on their own festering problems that should be the responsibility of the state. Another sign said, "Stop black-on-black crime," as this was a matter for the residents to take into their hands. Another sign said, "Save a life. Tell on your neighborhood drug dealer." Now, here what you see is the ominous placard blaring, "Addiction is slavery," over black hand clutching drug pills, reactivates the historic dishonor of servitude and links it syntagmatically with urban dispossession, except that here it suggests that today's inner city derelicts are to blame for their own predicament, insofar as their bondage is portrayed as a product not of subordination to a white master, abetted by an indifference political machinery, but it's portrayed as a relationship of self to self, in keeping with the neoliberal trope of individual responsibility that has percolated all the way to the rock bottom of the social order, as when my buddy Curtis seeks to establish his bona fides in the conversation by exclaiming about the street zombies that we are seeing as we drive down the street, who are caught in this vortex of drugs and despair. He says, "That's the life that they wanted to live. I chose the opposite." Indeed, both whites and the states are the absent presence that haunts this picture by their joint empirical invisibility and causal responsibility. Thirdly, what we see there is the decrepit physical setting, this unchecked institutional dysfunction, the grinding demoralization, and the pervasive aura of collective indignity suffusing the hyperghetto. They combine to tag its residents with an undesired differentness, and here I use the words of Irving Goffman in his classic book, Stigma, an undesired differentness whose discrediting effect is very extensive. And let me now speak about the three sets of effects of territorial stigma on the residents, on urban citizens and operators outside of the residence, and then on the state. First, people trapped in districts of social perdition, widely perceived as urban warts, nests of violence and vice, where only the rejects of society would tolerate living, these people respond to the taint associated with dwelling in this regio non grata of their metropolis by deploying 5 strategies of what I call symbolic and social self-protection. What are these strategies? So they respond to the stigma first by mutual distancing and the elaboration of micro-differences. They disown knowing people around them, and they claim that they're not like people in the neighborhood. Second, they have a strategy of lateral denigration. They take over the stigma and they apply it to the people in the neighborhood, but not me, but them, yes, across the street and so on and so forth. Thirdly, they retreat into the private sphere. Fourthly, they exit the neighborhoods. And fifthly, they sometimes they celebrate or embrace the outlaw image of the neighborhood and the lifestyle. And so what do these strategies do? They converge to internally, stigmatization feeds back into demoralization. They lead residents to disassociate themselves from their neighbors. This undermines local cohesion, hampers collective mobilization, and helps generate the very atomism and disorganization that the dominant discourse of denigration of these places said was already there. Now, I'm told that I don't have any more time, so I'm going to just wrap up in 3 lines with the effect on the state. The effect on the state. When urban degradation and symbolic devaluation intensified to the point where a neighborhood of relegation appeared to be beyond salvage, they provide political leaders and state bureaucrats with warrants for deploying aggressive policies of containment, discipline, and dispersal that further disorganize the urban poor under the pretext of improving their opportunities. And we see this with the campaign of deconcentration of public housing launched in the United States in the 1990s, which is now reaching Western Europe, where there's a kindred policy of destruction of large clusters of low-income estates now underway. And these policies propose a false spatial solution to the real economic and political quandaries destabilizing lower-class districts. So to conclude, I have proposed that the social psychology of place operates in the manner of a symbolic cog that links the macro determinants of urban political economy to the life options and strategies of the poor at ground level through the mediation of these negative collective representations of dispossessed districts, negative representations that come to be shared by the residents, by city dwellers around these neighborhoods, by commercial operators, and by the political and administrative elites which design and run the range of public policies and services aimed at deprived populations. This points to the need for detailed field studies tracking how stigma fastened on neighborhoods of relegation across advanced Western society. I used this particular field site because I didn't have the time to prepare a nice set of slides on Western Europe. I would have taken you to the various neighborhoods that I've mentioned, but this applies not only to the hyper-ghetto in the United States, but to the degraded working-class banlieue of France, to the Cinque Estates of the United Kingdom, to the Grottenwiesch of the Netherlands, and so on, to understand how the stigma fastened on the place twists the nexus of urban ecology, social morphology, and collective psychology, and skews the functioning of the institutions that shape the destiny of urban outcasts in the era of rising social insecurity. Thank you.
Where's the pointer?
They ignore it, but they care that's what it is.
Check this out the road somewhere. Thinking about really the link between.
Well, especially since you started the psychology, the psychology
Going
all
across
the
the
way,
levels,
all the way from the States to the neighborhood,
So,
And we're
street corner level.
exactly.
good afternoon.
And
Higher
you talk-
level, and I about the networks, and so to really.
In one level, I
Thank you for those
field of cultural production,
brilliant sort of insights.
scholarship. And the scholars will-
I'm going to use 59 slides so that the average for the panel sort of stays reasonable. But I'm going to attempt to sort of spatialize, I think, stuff that you guys have really articulated brilliantly. I'm going to sort of change the scale. I'm going to share with you some of our experiences in Mumbai with the students, things we're doing here at the studio, and I hope we're going to do in the future. Also, I think the question to scale, we're going to shift to a much smaller scale to examine this question of the neighborhood and neighborliness. And also the question, I think, is scale. I think I'll touch upon that, is scale, and this question of scale and robustness. I think, Dan, you sort of raised that. I think it's really sort of interesting. I think the discussion about cities and the question of urban ethics cannot be discussed without the question of spatial inequity and its exaggerated conditions in extreme density. Something which I believe we don't really have appropriate metrics for, density, equity. I think you talked about ecometrics. That was really interesting, the way you alluded to it, because I think in our own discipline, we have to work harder with this question. Because density of urban form measured in FAR, as we've seen, often has nothing to do with intensity of use, for example. Thus, the illusion of density and that of equity are often red herrings, I believe, in our discussions about ethics of the urban. And furthermore, today, especially in the global south, or the majority world, we must judge a city by the way the poor live. And how do we bring these questions together to create those appropriate metrics, I think, is a really critical question. And I think it's a fundamental criteria for applying to any global standards of sustainability or efficiency in the urban system. Again, we don't seem to have the appropriate metrics for this, except by sometimes celebrating best practices. And I was really relieved when Richard shared with us his sort of insight in this, and sort of it really is a usually unuseful category and a declarative mode. And I was really relieved to hear that in our seminar, Richard, because that has troubled me, and I do believe these metrics don't exist. More pointedly, I think in these conditions of cities like Mumbai, and I think this is an example where that house, which has 4 people living in it, has an FAR of 12, and that has an FAR of 0, and it has about 14 people living there. And that's what I mean by a complete scramble here in terms of the metrics we should sort of use. And I think in these conditions, like cities like Mumbai, which I call kinetic cities, clearly the notion of neighborhoods and neighborliness is a continuously reconfigured process, both in the way new networks evolve, with the ease with which technology permeates our lives, but also the rapid rate at which these cities begin to transform, spatially reconfigure themselves, and it also sort of reconfigures the lives we lead in these cities. And again, to refer to Richard's use of the analogy of the cell, the permeability of the urban system in these high density conditions actually creates an interesting symbiosis of collaboration and cooperation by default. Harvard Square, for example, I think has changed less physically in the last 20 years, 25 years, and my sidewalk in Mumbai changes every week. New residents appear, live for a while, move on. Other vendors occupy the street for an interim period. Families settle in for a few weeks. And it's really amazing how these transformations move at a speed that's unimaginable, sometimes just leaving their memory and then getting reconfigured again over time. And so this sort of process is what is sort of kinetic in nature, but it's also about the way we reconfigure the imagination of our neighborhood, and there's a blur between what is stable and unstable. The 4 stages of squatting, a diagram I use, really is emblematic of how our cities are made and unmade, and in this kind of sort of incrementalism, and I think this has a big bearing on how we might imagine neighborhoods. Also, the train system in Mumbai, which is really celebrated, I think begins to become more relevant as a moment of discussion with the fragmentation of labor markets, modes of productions, which now become networked over the city. And this sort of instrument begins to play a completely different role. And it actually muddles the neighborhood spatially. And I'm going to quote from Kaivan Mehta's new book, which is called Alice in Bhuleshwar, where he says, many have romanticized the trains in Bombay and Mumbai, and rightly so, but sometimes I cannot help feeling that these boxes of steel are pure nothingness, like coffins of steel. They transfer the city from here to there. They mix up the city like the milkman churning milk at Bhuleshwar. Neighborhoods in the city come to their railway stations, get scattered to be collected again in the evening, transforming the neighborhoods one left in the morning. As we step out of these rolling steel crates, we step into new neighborhoods, making them new again. And historically, I think what we've had is a condition in many sort of colonial cities of these two worlds spatially segregated, two neighborhoods with their own rules, one about disease, one about entrepreneurship, one about administration, made in completely different images. In the post-colonial condition, they begin to blur. This, of course, gets completely exaggerated as you have the kind of temporal city. And then this sort of the borders here become so permeable and so interconnected that there's a whole new notion of the neighborhood that begins to challenge us, I believe. And I think this is really an unintended city where the simultaneous interplay of the notions of rejection and affinity constitute a newly formed equilibrium. And I think it's this tension between rejection and affinity, again, something that Richard's been alluding to in the many seminars he's done here, which keep this equilibrium, but it also keeps productive tension into place. And this condition of the porous and permeable borders between the different worlds in the same space, I think is really a prerequisite for this sort of equilibrium. And so if we look at so you begin to get this sort of form of the city, and I think remember that temple there, because it's institutions like that that begin to create moments of sort of neutral grounds, of moments which become transferable, which create this permeability in a kind of institutionalized manner. And religion begins to, at many levels, play an incredibly interesting and important role in this whole process. And so the kinds of typologies that we look at in a city like Mumbai, the chawl, for example, is one that's very celebrated. This came out of the notion of entitlement housing, which was legislated in Mumbai in the late 19th century. And these are barrack-like, which were meant for single men who came and worked for 8 months and went back in the monsoon to agriculture. And over time, as they sold their agricultural land, they bought their families. We began to have 6 to 8 people sharing 100 square feet of space. And of course, there were many tensions that came out of this. And again, to quote a resident there who talked about how they shared one tap, 300 people shared one tap, and anxiety about water running out, and the fear that they would not get to the mill on time, which is where they worked, added an edge to the often frenzied competition among neighbors for their moment at the tap. Water probably generated more feuding, enmity, violence than any other aspect of chawl life. The tap should douse cold water upon any romantic assumptions about the natural warmth of the neighborhood life. In fact, fighting around water pipes in the chawl contributed to a steady flow of assault cases to the city's police courts. And so while you had this tension, you also had a moment here where castes completely dissipated. And people couldn't recognize caste or understand caste. And so you had a complete new formation in terms of neighborliness as a result of the density in this case and the tension around basic amenities. And I think this sort of extends itself in moments like this, where while the open space in the chawl was a dump for garbage, it also got transformed at moments for the coming together through festivals. And this sort of elasticity of urban space here, which had changing meanings in a sense, and this sort of temporal landscape, I think is worth recognizing in this condition of inequity, density in places like Mumbai. And of course, the slum becomes this other moment which is celebrated. And I think Mike Davis, for example, has estimated, and people have poo-pooed this, but he's estimated that by 2025 there'll be 33 million people in Mumbai, of which 70% will live in slums. And it's unlikely biologically or ecologically for this to be viable in any way. And so, this sets up a whole set of questions of how you act. It also, I think, challenges us in planning with the notion of time and in the formation of neighborhoods. And what I mean by this is how one can actually look at these temporal landscapes and how one can factor time and moments in time for this. For example, you may argue that a long-term solution for this might be evolved over 15 years, but that means it's a child living in these slums that goes through a whole school life in those 10 years. And so what does that mean in terms of how our planning can imagine or how we can bring imaginations which factor in time. Catherine Boo has just done a wonderful book where she became part of a slum. It's called Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and she has done this book on a slum in Mumbai, which is set next to the CBD and between the CBD and the airport. It's an incredible insight and a contemporary insight of these contestations in a global world. And just to quote, she talks about Asha, who is one of the many, many characters there. Asha also means hope, and this is a woman who commands a lot of power in the slum because she's become a mediator. And so to quote, she had by now seen the obvious truth that Mumbai was a hive of hope and ambition to a profitable corollary. Mumbai was a place of festering grievance and ambient envy. Was there a soul in this enriching, unequal city who didn't blame his dissatisfaction on someone else? Wealthy citizens accused the slum dwellers of making the city filthy and unlivable, even as an oversupply of human capital kept the wages of their maids and their chauffeurs low. Slum dwellers complained about the obstacles the rich and powerful erected, preventing them from sharing in new profits. Everyone, everywhere complained about his or her neighbors. But in the 21st century city, fewer people joined up to take these disputes to the streets, as group identities based on caste, ethnicity, and religion gradually attenuated. Anger and hope were being privatized, like so much else in Mumbai. This development increased the demand for uncanny mediators, human shock absorbers for the colliding, narrow, construed interests of one of the world's largest cities. And so this notion of mediators, I think, becomes very critical, and entire neighborhoods are configured by the way these mediators work in time. And I want to just share with you, again, as a reaction, just a project we were engaged in, responding to the question of neighborliness. I think it gets really exaggerated at the point of the public toilets in the slums of Mumbai. And again, here I mean time. Something that might be useful for 5 years is, I think, a worthwhile project. And look at this data. The UN estimates it's a toilet for 1,440 people. Spark, which is a local NGO, brings that down to 800 as they consider it more accurate. And so we worked with Spark to see what we might do with this. Of course, the municipality believes it's much lower, and their target is even much lower. And that's sort of a pipe dream. But this is what the toilet is. It sits in the middle of a slum. And the problem with the toilet is women can't use it and children can't use it because at night it has no electricity and it's taken off the grid virtually just to save money. And so we came up with this sort of idea of doing a public toilet which was with solar panels off the grid. But what we did was above the toilet we placed the lowest caste, which is a man who cleans the toilet. And gave him the highest spot in the neighborhood and created a community center next to it as a way that children could study there at night and women could use it. They could have community gatherings, and it becomes a center for that community to galvanize a sense of that neighborhood as a design sort of idea. And so these are just some projections. We clad it in flowers because that's also used by the temples, and so it can be actually productive. And it also breaks the associations with what a toilet might be. And we've begun to build one, and that's the kind of vantage because it also gives you a completely different gaze on it. So, and I believe that this is where time, I think, being factored in is productive in the creation and formulation of these neighborhoods. This is from Slumdog Millionaire, the first half of the film, which was through the eyes of these children who ran through the labyrinth of the slum. It was done Hollywood style, and the second half was Bollywood style, where it was a gaze from a high-rise building as this child began to align with the underworld. And the government is reconstructing neighborhoods in this manner. This is the famous Slum Redevelopment Authority scheme, where the slum is divided into half the people are put to a transfer camp, a new building is given to a developer, the land is given to the developer to develop, and you start beginning to have these adjacencies, but completely reconfigured. And this is that image from Slumdog Millionaire, which then leads us into another kind of typology, which is a kind of distant gaze on the city and the gated community, which is what the new typology in a city like Mumbai is, where you are completely detached and above the city. And this is an example where the temple comes back, and this is the temple in a gated community with hard edges, which is not permeable. and this is self-contained. And the same typology is co-opted in a completely different way. A brilliant book by Arvind Adiga called The White Tiger, which many of you might have read, is about looking at life like this through the eyes of someone who works in a place like this. And to quote, I knew without, and this is the servant speaking to an audience around the world, I knew without being told I also had to take care of the apartment. Any cleaning there was to be done, I would do, and then come back and wait for the door with my folded hands until Mukesh sir said, you can go now and be ready at 8 a.m. No hanky-panky just because you're in the city, you understand? Then I went down in the lift, got out of the building, went down the stairs to the servants' quarters in the basement. I don't know how buildings are designed in your country, but in India, every apartment block, every house, every hostel, every hotel is built with a servants' quarter, sometimes at the back, and sometimes, as in the case of Buckingham Towers, B block, underground. A warren of interconnected rooms where all the drivers, cooks, sweepers, maids, chefs of the apartment block can rest, sleep, and wait. When our masters wanted us, an electric bell began to ring throughout the quarters. We would rush to a board and find a red light flashing next to the number of the apartment whose servant was needed upstairs. I walked down 2 flights of stairs, pushed open the door to the servants' quarters. The moment I got there, the other servants screamed, they yelled, they howled with laughter. Servants need to abuse other servants. It's been bred into us, the way Alsatian dogs are bred to attack strangers. We attack anyone who's familiar. Here the boundaries, I think, take on a completely different meaning. They get rigid, they get self-contained, there's no permeation. It sets up a whole social life, which I think can become very lethal. And I think it was Ivan Illich who said, tell me how fast you travel and I'll tell you who you are. In India today, I can ask someone how much urban land they command and I can tell you who they are. Inequity dissolves in a condition of high density. People make space elastic. The difference between the rich and the poor dissipate as porosities between territories is heightened and exaggerated. Of course, rules exist for these interpenetrations. The time when this can happen are predetermined. But it's also this membrane condition and a true border set within a much broader ecology. And I think I just sort of want to end by another example, just because we're trying to spatialize this in a design school, which I think I revisited after a long time and I found really relevant, and in the 5 minutes I'll run through this. Because I think the question of how do you design for this condition always comes up. And interestingly, in India, we adopted the American town planner Terence Perry's neighborhood unit idea in our post-independent condition, which sort of underwent a lot of transformations but inspired planning in many ways, and I don't have the time to go into that. But I'm going to sort of jump to a case study which I think is really interesting, because this is how do you kind of actually reconcile this condition, and how do you actually maybe even respond in terms of designing a neighborhood if we were to take on that challenge. And this is a project that was done by Charles Correa in '85. And this is the project, and this is other housing. And CITCO, which is the City Development Authority, were very confused by the organic nature of what he was proposing. And so they called it the artist's village, and they called everything else mass housing. And so that actually speaks to exactly the idea of these different imaginations. And so this was very interesting, and I think it's really a significant project, especially looking at it now 25 years later. The studio visited it. We're planning to document it in greater detail. But he took on the challenge of actually accommodating this entire range of demography that existed. And to quote him, a policy of equity plots would have the added advantage of not predetermining social and economic mix in the neighborhood or across the city. Most planning today, no matter how liberated its intentions, ends up with a rigid caste system of residential areas as witnessed in Chandigarh. The reason for this is simple. Since the plots are vastly different sizes, the planners have to decide about their positioning within a sector ahead of time. In such a situation, there's no way a planner can place the clerks' houses cheek by jowl with the ministers, and once the plan is implemented on site, the pattern cannot be changed. So we get cities which are rigid, inflexible, and do not respond to the social forces which are constantly at work and which make older undesigned urban centers such an organic mix of income groups, communities, permeability. And so he basically responded to the row housing, which is what was sort of done. And I must say that a lot of housing that we are seeing, some of which is celebrated and I think very, very important, and I'm just wrapping up with a few slides now, is premised a lot on architecture and its variations in controlling it, but not so much on site planning and not privileging architecture so much. And I think this one did precisely that, which is what makes it very interesting. And so its logic is sort of picks that idea, and it demonstrates that the efficiencies are the same even if you complicate it a little bit. So it accommodates exactly the same efficiency. It sets up very few rules, which is just no windows on two walls, but it also it respects the length of pipe and infrastructure, which is what sort of limits projects like this otherwise, and it displays how you could have a whole range. And basically, what it does is it takes this sort of module and kind of creates a more complicated site delineation, emphasizing the site delineation above privileging the architecture, and then translating that over a much broader site. It's 600 units, achieving a very high density comparable to what we see in the city in this sort of site plan that was proposed. And the densities that are sort of achieved here is 500 people per hectare. And so that's quite high given the form. And this is what was built as the sample module. And this is what made the agency make it the artist village, because they thought this is really cool. But what they didn't understand was in all of this, the cost of construction was so low that the architect had not even planned for it to last more than 5 monsoons, with the intention that what you were factoring in was only the land value, so people could pull this down. And this is one of the few houses that was abandoned, or the person who bought it didn't come back, and you can see the effect weather has had on it. And I visited in '86 as a student, and just keep in mind these two profiles, because the next slide shows you what happened to it in the 20 years. And that's how it transformed. And it continues to transform. There's construction there all the time. Those two rules are maintained, so neighborliness is demonstrated by the respect you have by not having windows on those two walls. People have completely transformed it in investments which have been incremental. The range of income groups there are the range I showed you, which is mind-boggling to imagine in a situation like India that you would have it. It has craftsmen working there, because incremental investments mean an incredible amount of employment. And we happened, the group visited a cluster which was actually empty, but the one man from the cluster or two people were yet around. And what was very interesting was they had all gone together for a wedding of one of the people who lived in the 16 houses that formed these clusters. And they talked about themselves being a family, and they actually talked to us about how the architecture of the place had contributed to that process. And these were houses that had all been transformed. Courtyards sometimes get used for temporary events like this. And I mean, the range of transformations is absolutely incredible. So that's what it looks like now. The roofscape is somewhat intact. That is what it could have been, because the rest of the housing was like this, and a lot of it is yet abandoned. No one has actually moved in. It's the public housing model, but was yet the neighborhood unit in its abstract sense in terms of amenities. But I think and it does achieve exactly the densities that you would get in that development, which is a slice of the city. And so just with a couple of words to end, I think in spite of these many disjunctures that we see in environments like the one that I've described, I think what I think is important to celebrate is, one is, I think, that these are pluralistic processes in place. The second is, I think, the binaries that we set up in terms of the formal and informal in design terms are unuseful. I think we can go beyond that if we begin to imagine them as permeable boundaries, permeable borders in the way Richard sort of frames it. And I think that is much more inspirational for design, because I think it then creates the margins for adjustment that these sort of simultaneous worlds and existences demand. Thank you very much.
Okay, we are really running low on time, so what I think we're going to do, I know we stand between lunch and us and lunch, the questions. I would like to open out to the audience, and we'll collect a couple questions, and then we'll allow each of the speakers to respond in turn, so we don't have a one-on-one. So we probably have time for 3-4 questions max. You sir.
Yes. What a wonderful panel. My name's Alexander von Hoffman. I'm a historian of cities and neighborhoods, and I just enjoyed the panel so much. And I went through some kind of moment when I saw 63rd Street, where I spent some very early years of my life, growing up a couple of blocks away from there. And maybe maybe because I'm a historian, or maybe because I know Woodlawn a little bit, I was struck by a couple of things. And I'd like to throw out a couple of concepts to the panel, not so much Rahul, because the density that you provided there underlines one of my points. One is history of places, which was, we heard Robert mention it. The Woodlawn neighborhood, people have been trying to revive it, save it for over 60 years. You can go, planners may be interested. There's a Chicago Plan Commission, 1946 plan of it, which represents something that we could all look at. But it was once a white neighborhood, and it was a white neighborhood in trouble. It became a black neighborhood in trouble, and now it's a depopulated neighborhood. I applaud the idea of studying such places. I love the idea of a concept of this, that, typology. But I bring up two things. Besides history, population movements, which were touched upon. But in order for Woodlawn and neighborhoods like that to be depopulated, they have ceased to attract people. And that brings up two questions I'd like to just hear you think about. Widening the scope of our studies. Where did the people go, or where did those kinds of people go? Where are they attracted? We happen to know in Chicago, they go to the southern suburbs, but also out of the region altogether, Milwaukee, Atlanta, places like that. I think that's part of the picture. And the other thing that Rahul's wonderful presentation brings up is density. What you can do with density and how difficult it is when you have none whatsoever. And so those are my two concepts, the population flows and density.
Hi, thank you. I want to come back to the question of scale that Diane mentioned at the beginning. By bringing in an important social actor to neighborhoods, which is the migrant, and specifically transnational migrants. And when I say transnational migrants, I mean people who maintain active, thick social ties to their communities of origin, and who come from very different neighborhoods than the ones that they're currently living in. And I want to sort of ask you, because I study transnational migrants in New York and in Jamaica Plain, and I wonder their notion of neighborhood in specific places right now in the U.S. is mediated by an idea of a neighborhood which is very different. And their idea of place and the construction of place for them is very different and mediated by very different sites. Their idea of civicness is also transformed. And their idea also of politics and which sort of state structures they relate to is also complicated by this transnational dense social ties. So I wonder, my question is basically, how do we factor in the idea of neighborhood? And when we study and theorize about neighborhoods, how do we factor in the transnational dimension? And it's not just so much that the migrants are bringing in ideas from one place and trying to adapt it to the United States, but from the US they're also taking ideas and trying to adapt it back home. So it becomes a circular conversation about neighborhoods that is sort of makes it more complex and enriching, but also harder to analyze and theorize as social and urban studies researchers.
Probably one or two, maybe. Are there any other questions? Okay, two more, and then we will open up because I'm under strict orders. We have to be out of here by 1:40, so two more questions.
Hi. So my question or comment, I think, goes to the presentations by Professor Waquant and Samson. I thought a lot about the relationships that you were raising between the built environment, social structure, and collective representation, and appreciated the references to the Chicago School. But I wanted to sort of put on the table, how do we, with regard to Deepak's question about history and the other person's reference to history, sort of the racialized orientation of sociology, because certainly Du Bois made these connections before the Chicago School did in the 1890s, and with the Philadelphia Negro, he really, I think, was sort of beginning to link these ideas of economic positionality collective representation, individual psychic experience and space. And you know, in my experience in urban sociology, we have yet to seriously revisit the Du Boisian perspective and apply it to our theorizations of space, social, spatial, you know, sort of conceptualization. So I just wanted to get your perspective on this.
And one more. We'll have one more, and then we'll turn it over to the panel.
I was, I guess, inspired by Loi Waquant's critique of deconcentration to ask each of you to speak a little bit more about ideologies of deconcentration, because they seem to be somehow at the heart of these, each of your presentations in different ways, from Rahul's presentation of integrated neighborhood to Robert Samson's point about the kind of continuity of class relations in neighborhoods. And so on the one hand, Loi Waquant, you bring it up as a kind of state violence, in a sense, deconcentration as state violence and ideology. On the other hand, clearly it's a kind of war against the social stigmatization of the neighborhood. So I'm wondering if each of you could speak to it.
Maybe, Rahul, is there anything that you'd like to respond?
Maybe later.
Okay. Well, Rob, do you want to go, and then Louis?
Sure, great.
You had a couple more questions.
Great
maybe,
set of
and then-
questions. Wish we could go on. So the first one on history, I totally agree. I mean, it's a fantastic question, and I spent last year on sabbatical, and there were a couple of historians there, and I decided that I was a closet historian. I wanted to become one, become much more interested in it over the course of my career. And I agree. I think that trying to understand stability and change really does require understanding of the histories. I've tried to do that a bit. I'm no historian. But in my book, in the sense of really trying to drill down and understand particular communities, not just the objective characteristics that characterize them, but their histories, their cultural, the sense that people have about them. And that's crucially important. I mean, if you take a place like Woodlawn, which you noted, it has a particular identity, went through a set of terrible crises, really, in terms of depopulation, arson, abandonment, and so forth. But what I would say is, and I want to inject a bit of optimism here, because in a sense you could view this as just an inexorable tale of decline. But I think we need to be careful with that, and I think in the spirit of the thinking about political here, that there is resistance, and individuals resist. And if you think about it, you mentioned, I think you mentioned the two, which is the Woodlawn organization, which started back in the 60s. Reverend Brazier, who was a pastor of the Apostolic Church of God, and he became bishop. Bishop. Well, yeah, he died, and then his son was. Anyway, that organization was founded on a different sort of model in terms of issues of racial change and so forth, but it turned into a broad-based community organization that, in collaboration with other institutions, once the University of Chicago realized that it should no longer think of itself as insulated and everything else outside the walls, at least imagined walls, were not enemies. There's a series of collaborations that have gone on, and just to make a long story short, which I just loved Louis' picture on East 63rd Street. But the thing is, today, 2010, the same block has middle-class homes. Well, no, but they're not lived in by University of Chicago faculty.
Students.
No, there's a set of middle-class homes that have been developed. They go further south of 63rd Street. It's not all of Woodlawn, but there's a lot of new development that's going on, and I actually have some pictures of that and talk a bit about it in the book. West Woodlawn still looks like that. So there are changes afoot. There are communities that are stabilizing, and part of it is through organization, the sense of identity. Communities such as Chatham, working class communities on the south side of Chicago, surrounded by the ghetto, I think have a sense of real pride of place. These are working class communities, and despite assaults from violence, from foreclosures, there are residents there, and there was an incident where a man's son was murdered outside. People refuse to give in, refuse and are fighting back. So there's different kinds of political and civic resistance, which I think we need to pay attention to, and I try to do that. I totally agree, though, that we need to take into account these population flows, and that's part of what I study. A lot of it is very structured. Surprisingly, even, people on the west side tend to move further west, south side further south, the south suburbs, which introduces a new set of problems so that we can't, first of all, the concept of inner city is no longer appropriate. Doesn't mean anything ecologically. Now we see suburbs in the south side of Chicago that are suffering the problems historically that were attributed to the inner city. Places like Harvey and so forth are depopulated ghettos now, and many of the communities in Chicago are actually doing quite well. And that, I think, also relates to your question about history, and I totally agree with you. I would point to, though, Drake and Caton, for example, in the Black Metropolis, which in a sense is a mediator of the Chicago school. I mean, sort of Du Bois, Philadelphia Negro, the Chicago school, Drake and Caton, all deeply concerned with issues of race and segregation. But then that brings us to the second sort of set of questions, which is about migration, and certainly how migration is changing the American city and cities around the world, but we mentioned this too, the emergence, and many communities that were quite poor or, quote, concentrated disadvantage are now becoming renewed through immigration. I find this a fascinating process. I've written some on this, in particular how it goes against the grain. So, for example, concentration of immigration and first generation immigrants have lower rates of violence compared to second generation and third generation. So in other words, immigrant communities are some of the safest around, and sort of goes against the narrative of what we perceive in terms of disorder and un-American. In fact, even in terms of norms, some of the most conservative views on work and hard work and so forth are found in immigrant communities. It's a fascinating development. Chicago is growing, New York is growing, and it's mainly through immigration. And so these new immigrant communities are fundamental to our understanding of the city. And finally, just ideologies of deconcentration. I like that because if you think about the ways that concentration of urban poverty has been thought about, and this is oversimplified, of course, but in one sense, there is this sort of state level, okay, these are bad, stigmatized communities. We somehow just want to get rid of them. And Robert Taylor Holmes, if you think about it, 35,000 people lived there, and were literally, people moved out and it was blown up. And they were disposed of. And literally, there was dynamite, and one day on a Saturday morning, it was in the Trib, and you could see the smoke go up. And it's really disturbing if you think about these were people's homes. And we think that, well, everyone must have wanted to leave, and they were terrible places at some level, but if you interviewed the residents and you look at what happened to some of the housing programs, such as Moving to Opportunity, where the notion, which I think is sort of middle-class bias, and by the way, Kenneth Clark in 1965 in Dark Ghetto anticipated this in terms of where he said, why would we expect to exchange the pathologies of the suburb for our own, for the ghetto, in the sense that people that were thought to move to the suburbs or to better communities actually didn't go as far. The take-up rate in Moving to Opportunity, which for those of you who don't know about it, is a federal experiment to give people vouchers to move to neighborhoods that are better off, less income. And only 50% of the population took it up, number one, which is a fascinating question in and of itself. And they didn't move very far. And of course, part of this is due to social ties and a sense of identity with communities that even though they were poor, and the Links, I think, the Links point that from the outside they're seen as bad, they're shitty neighborhoods, why wouldn't you want to get out? But there were other things that people valued in them. And so my interpretation of Moving to Opportunity, I called it Moving to Inequality. It's sort of a reproduction of what was going on. But what I would say is there's sort of two main ways to think about this. Vouchers, you give people a voucher to get out of the bad school or the bad neighborhood that inequality has wrought, right? So it's just out of sight, out of mind, or kind of destroy the entire context. And I argue for neither, which is mainly, not that, of course, I'm not anti-voucher, but for the most part. but rather what I call intervening at the scale of the city and community, which is attempting to reconstruct and rebuild. An interesting way the last presentation was about that. Within the spaces of disadvantage and trying to retain the social ties that are there, to intervene at that level to build it back up. Now that sounds a little utopian, but nonetheless.
We're in planning school, so it sounds great.
So maybe planners don't think that's that crazy, but that is intervening at the place level, and that's the third way alternative that I argued for. So.
Thank you, Rob. Louis?
I'll start by just adding a footnote to your last comment, which is Mary Petillo wrote a beautiful paper for a collective volume of urban policy wonks called Improving Poor Black Neighborhoods as Is. Mm-hmm. That is, what is needed is to improve these places. Mm-hmm. Why disperse the residents? I'm enormously stimulated by all the questions. I'm going to try to answer briefly. First, on history. Yes, we do need not only a historical perspective, but a historical perspective of the longue durée. Mm-hmm. And what I showed you is the tail end of the collapse and the implosion of the historic ghetto, of which I would argue there are three ages. There's the age of the building of the ghetto between 1914 and 1935. The ghetto emerges as a crescent institution from below. And here, of course, we must specify what a ghetto is. A ghetto is not just a segregated neighborhood, not a poor neighborhood, not a neighborhood of vice and violence, but it's, in the felicitous phrase of, Richard said it here, a phrase expression that you will never forget after I utter it. In his chapter on the invention of the ghetto of Venice in 1516, in Renaissance Italy, he calls the urban ghetto an urban condom. And it's an urban condom because it allows for the penetration into the city of a stigmatized category that is needed because Jews bring a variety of economic services that are needed by the city rulers. But at the same time, there can be no mixing because they are stigmatized, degraded, and degrading category. And they would be a loss of honor if you had in particular intimate contact with them. Now think about African Americans moving into the northern industrial city in the United States during the 40s era, 1915 to 1965, is the exact same phenomenon. You need this pariah group because it's going to bring needed labor and skilled labor power for the factory economy. It's absolutely vital because of the World War I has ended the supply of migrants and has created a booming economy. And yet, this is a reviled, degraded, and degrading group with whom there can be no intimate contact. So you bring the urban condom again. And the urban condom is really, a ghetto is really a socio-spatial contraption that does two things. It combines four structural elements: stigma, constraint, spatial confinement, and institutional encasement and parallelism to fulfill two functions: economic extraction and social ostracization. You exploit a group, but a group that you must maintain at a distance. Of course, there's a contradiction there because since you want to exploit it, you bring it in contact. And so so it's when you want to have those two things together, economic exploitation and social ostracization, that you develop a ghetto, which is this sort of socio-spatial contraption, this urban condom. So now once you've specified what a ghetto is, then you can see that it has the ghetto of Chicago in particular has three ages. The first age, the building of the ghetto. Then the ghetto gets rebuilt between the New Deal and the decade after World War I. It gets rebuilt by the state from above, and this is a story told very well by one of your colleagues, Arnold Hirsch, making the second ghetto, race and housing, in Chicago, 1940, 1960. And then comes the third age of the ghetto, which is the age of collapse and implosion, which is what I described in Urban Outcast, and its replacement by, on the one side, the hyper-ghetto, which is this doubly segregated by race and class territory of abandonment that fulfills only the function of social ostracization of a category now, in a sense, economically and symbolically devalued, lower class, marginal fractions of the black working class. And the second element of that contraption is the segregated black middle-class neighborhoods that have grown in the neighborhoods vacated by the great white migration to the suburbs after blacks move into the cities. And so once we have these three ages, and once we can understand the ghetto as a historical animal that effectively doesn't become transformed, but dies in the 1960s and becomes replaced by a novel socio-spatial construction, then we can understand the special plight of Woodlawn. Is that Woodlawn, the problem of timing is that it joined the ghetto when the ghetto was collapsing. And so in a sense, before it became a functioning sort of community organized, then it immediately became this territory of dread and dissolution that becomes the emblem of the stigmatized neighborhood. The second question is the flow and stock. It's a very good question. There's a lot of movement we must distinguish the container and the contained. We must never confound the properties of the population in these neighborhoods and the kind of neighborhood and the structure and the function of that neighborhood. The structure and the function of the neighborhood can change while the population doesn't change, and vice versa. The population can change while the structure and function of the neighborhood does change. And of course, the story of Woodlawn is that in the 60s, it was still at the tail end of being a ghetto, fulfilling these twofold functions that I mentioned, and it was a poor black population. It is poor black population today, but it's no longer in the same container. And I think Sharkey in particular, and there, if we go comparative, we have even a better. One of the distinctive features of the United States when you go comparatively is the residents of the neighborhoods of relegation at the bottom migrate a lot, but they migrate in neighborhoods that are very similar. That is, they only move from Woodlawn to West Englewood. That is, to a neighborhood that is the same container and that has the same socio-demographic properties. One of the interesting features of European countries, and now we know this from very good quantitative data, there's a lot of mobility, for instance, in the French banlieue, and there's tend to be a mobility upward, and it's the same in Sweden and so on and so forth. So it's and so history helps us get a sense of the stock and the flow. Very briefly, in one line, the theoretical ancestors, I welcome your reminder, and I would actually use that occasion to remind people of Friedrich Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England, which is a fabulous study of Manchester, which has been in part discredited because it's the most studied British city by historians, and a lot of these data and observations weren't correct. But he has the diagram of the Chicago school before the Chicago school. He has the notion that there's a spatial structure that is separate from the flows of population. He has also the notion of moral and cultural regions. He argues even that the working class of England developed a particular culture because it became spatially segregated from the bourgeoisie. So many of the key propositions that we attribute to the Chicago school are in fact found in Engels' model. And then lastly, on the state and the deconcentration, I think it's a very ambivalent, it's a two-sided phenomenon. First of all, we must not forget that concentration of poverty can have a lot of advantages. When you are among people who have the same income and the same culture, you have social capital and support, and dispersing poor people cuts them off from their networks of reciprocity, and so on and so forth. Secondly, we must realize that substitute housing is never provided on a sufficient scale whenever these operations of destruction of large-scale concentrations of poor happen. And thirdly, nobody is talking about concentrations of wealth, and nobody is proposing to disperse concentrations of wealth.
And speaking of dispersal, I'm sorry to interrupt this really rich, provocative discussion. Thank you so much to all the panelists and the audience.